Greetings, everyone. This is the Hipster Snek, and preemptive apologies for the camera quality for some of today's footage. Why? Because we're going to be taking a look at another piece of Snek tech, and this time I managed to land a specimen for a dissection for this episode. Well, it's not a live specimen. This Nintendo 64 was listed as already broken when I bought it, so I figured that way I could take it apart for your pleasure and not have to worry about breaking anything in the process. And yes, if you couldn't have guessed today, we'll be looking at and taking apart a Nintendo 64, and doing so by way of untested cell phone camera. So bear with our dust as the site is still largely under construction. Let's start at the beginning. Released in 1996 and codenamed Project Reality, then Ultra 64, before settling on the name that we know it by today, the N64 is quite an unusual piece of hardware. If Wikipedia is to be believed, it was direct competition for the PlayStation the First and the Sega Saturn, which we covered in the last Snek Tech. Yeah, something about this generation is undeniably fascinating to me. Mostly because of how absolutely boneheaded most of it ends up looking, benefit of hindsight or no. By the end of its life cycle, it had sold about 32 million units, or about 1/3 of what the PlayStation managed and about 3 times that of the Saturn, and it was discontinued in 2002. It was also the last major console to use cartridges up until the release of the Nintendo Switch some 15 years after. Brand new, the suggested retail price was about $200 USD, and nowadays these things have been so overproduced, 40 to 60 can land you a fully functional unit. Let me begin our breakdown by talking about the controller first, as it's probably the thing that will stand out the most at a glance. Who designed this trident-shaped monstrosity? Octodad? It's designed as if they intended the player to have 3 hands, so most games never utilize the estranged shoulder-mounted L button or the control pad at all. On the right-hand side opposite that are some colorful buttons, including the B and A button, coded green and blue, and 4 yellow C buttons, which really should have been a second analog stick. The GameCube eventually figured that much out, but not this one so much. Dead center is a red start button and the control stick that shredded tiny children's hands while playing Mario Party. And tucked away, hidden on the back, is the Z trigger, one of the few clever and ergonomic design decisions made on the otherwise inhuman contraption, as the left hand is prone to curling around this naturally. And while we're looking at the backside anyway, we have an expansion slot where the rumble pack could be affixed. I admit I have something of a fondness for this level of functionality and built-in expandability, which is pretty uncommon in most consoles. Closest analog I can even consider is the Dreamcast's VMU memory cards, but that's a Snek Tech for another day. Looks like these are held together by 7 main support screws, but in my experience, controllers are kinda boring internally, mostly a circuit board and some input receivers, so that's enough of that. Lastly, on the opposite shoulder is just an R button, which as I recall also rarely ever saw use. If I haven't made it clear, I really don't like this controller. I'd go as far as to say just looking at it is kind of unpleasant. When I first went to grab a Super Nintendo or a GameCube controller, I knew immediately what was expected of me and where my thumbs were intended to be rested. This thing is just really badly designed right out of the gate, and here's an interesting complaint. These controllers are weirdly small. Now, I freely admit to having small hands for a grown man, but it still feels like these were intended for baby fingers. Also, the controller cord is only 6 feet total, which I suppose was better in older living rooms, but good luck setting this one up in a modern one. Next, having 2 basic function buttons pretty much meant that any game ported to the N64 either had to be dumbed down or rely extensively on the C buttons, which, as I said, really shouldn't have existed in the first place. So you'd get games like the Zelda titles, which relied heavily on the C inputs, or games more in line with GoldenEye or Turok, which more relied on the pistol-like Z button to get around these limitations. Now, I will say, in the latter case, it does feel rather natural, except for the fact that I've never been forced to fire a gun left-handed, but that is a little nitpicky to be fair. So let's set the controller down and have a good look at the main unit itself next. Alright now, the base frame of the N64 is nothing to write home about. It's a charcoal gray box with a fairly low profile, being a little less wide than a Super Nintendo and a bit shorter to boot. Topside, we have a functionally and aesthetically useful set of double doors ready to receive N64 cartridges, if I had any. We also have our power and reset buttons, whose purposes should be frankly obvious, and this little trapdoor thing. And inside is this cheery-looking little red thing. Or mine's red at least, I don't know if all of them are. Mine also has some scratches on it because it was so deep in there I required a pair of channel locks to remove it from the base unit. I also later learned that Nintendo had a removal tool that you could get specifically for this thing, but I never came across any in my time setting this video up, and I learned that a little bit too late, so yeah. So what is this cheery little red thing, you ask? This is the N64 RAM expansion module. This baby holds up to 4 whole megabytes of RAM capacity, effectively doubling the system's base amount. Now, the console didn't actually come with this by default, so someone must have upgraded it at some point. Fun bit of trivia, a game-breaking bug would occur without the module while playing Donkey Kong 64, so the game was actually bundled alongside it. Quite the bizarre workaround. Can't think of any PC title that just stuffed RAM kits into their packaging. Not sure I'd trust a PC game that did, but that aside, a fair few other games demanded its presence for various technical reasons. Zelda Majora's Mask required it just to play, ditto for Perfect Dark, and many other games got better or extended graphical options from its inclusion. Now, I'm not dinging the console for this. Upgradability and planning ahead is the name of the game in digital entertainment, but it does show how far the tech has come. 8 megabytes of RAM in the 90s could get you quite a ways ahead, graphically speaking. Also, I don't really know why, but I just really like how this thing looks for some reason. Alright, back to the full body tour. The N64 is quite the titan of a power supply on its rear side, and it's completely detachable too. This monster reigns supreme on the south side of a north-facing N64, and it actually terminates in a standard 2-prong wall plug. This is a design decision I 100% wholeheartedly endorse. There really is nothing quite as terrible as trying to plug in a gigantic power brick into a power strip that has to share its real estate with several neighbors to begin with. Good job, N64, you knocked it out of the park on that one. Next door to that is a proprietary connector, because of course it is, linking the console to CRT TVs by means of composite video cables, as shown here, or S-video connectors, which were also available at the time. All in all, the standard for 90s consoles, and a trend that the Big N wouldn't even attempt to buck for at least 2 more console cycles. But in this case, it actually makes sense for it to be this way. Now, turning the entire thing over yields really only one thing of note, an expansion bay. This was supposed to be for the 64DD, which does exist in the same sense that Santa Claus exists, in your hearts. But since this never came to fruition, this literally does nothing. Yay! Short paragraph this time. Now, the next thing to do is to open her up and have a look at what's under the hood. Now, the basic Phillips head screws in my unit were actually already gone when I unboxed it. The real devil of the situation is there are, get this, proprietary screws that hold this thing together. 6 of them. 3 in the front, and 3 lining the back. You know how much us tech guys just love proprietary technologies? I mean, the screwdriver adapter set cost me like $7 on Amazon. And while I was tempted to just hit it with a hammer, I decided maybe to show a little restraint, maybe just this one time. Alright, let's do this with a touch of grace and subtlety, and there. The nice thing is the motherboard is laid flat along the console's floor, meaning that you can get a really nice look at the cross-section here. This being the top-down view gives you a clear view into where things like the cards, the RAM expansion, and the controllers all plug into the console proper. Now that we're here, let's geek out over some hardware. For instance, the N64 CPU chip is the NEC VR4300, made by NEC and Toshiba. This is a derivative of its 4200 counterpart, and the particular 4300 seated in the console is yet another derivative iteration with a special pin alignment called the NUS CPU. You can actually see it labeled as such right over here. I tried to find where this chip was used elsewhere, and basically speaking, it wasn't. Some low-end PCs used it, but that was the full extent of its commercial success. Without getting too into the tech specs, a lot of sources of the day tried to compare these to the then prominent Pentium chips without much success there either. The RAM we've already touched on a little bit, but there's more to learn. By default, the console came with 4 MB of RAM, expandable to 8 as mentioned, utilizing that slot seen here. Now, a clever trick that the RAM Lite box used was that none of the RAM was specialized for specific purposes, meaning resources could be allocated using a system called Rambus DRAM. If you're interested, I recommend reading up on it. It's a fascinating bit of trivia, but the standard died in 2003, when a little something called DDR SD-RAM took over and became industry standard henceforth. However, what that meant for the N64 was a dynamic memory system that could utilize its all-too-limited resources quite effectively. This was aided somewhat by the cartridges themselves offering a bit in the way of additional hardware support, but I don't really want to get into that just yet. Or rather, first, Towards the center of the unit is the Reality Coprocessor, or the RCP in US, which handled audio processing for the console. Interestingly enough, in my hours of researching, I couldn't find word on a video processing unit. That's because the Reality Coprocessor handles both for some of the reasons I listed when I was discussing the dynamic nature of the console's RAM. It seems the CPU and coprocessor pretty much handled everything, with some help in a Team Lift tech setup courtesy of the carts themselves. Okay, now let's talk about that for a moment. The carts are quite small all told, and like their Forerunner systems, the actual hardware of the cartridges is a fraction of the actual space that's being occupied here. Most of it's actually dead air. And this particular decision was quite the technical trade-off. CDs had larger capacities and were coming down in price in terms of what it cost to produce, but suffered the newfound obstacle known as load times. Loading was more or less non-existent on the N64's hardware, but so were things like clean looping music tracks, FMVs, cutscenes as they're understood elsewhere, nearest neighbor interpolation, and basically the better part of any third-party support. That last one is largely because of the coding of the console was arcane and troublesome, and in part because the cartridges were, of course, proprietary property of Nintendo. This made licensing the rights to make games, and actually making said games, an arduous task, which I alluded to briefly in my previous video. Gee, Snek, I hear some of you saying at this point, with all this put together, you make it sound like the N64 was a failure or something. Well, I hate to say it, but it was. The PlayStation blew past it by leaps and bounds with cheaper means of producing the actual discs, incredibly robust third-party support thanks to handing out dev kits like candy, and thanks to its successor actually having backwards compatibility, it also vastly outlasted the N64. What this meant on the whole is the N64 had a terrible controller, mediocre specs, and maybe 24 games worth playing across the entirety of her library, more than half being first and second party, courtesy of the moaning Rare at the time. Worst of all, Nintendo effectively did it all to themselves, by going back on a deal to make a CD-based console with Sony as their partner, essentially giving Sony the blueprints to the death knell of the 64, and alienating several third parties including Squaresoft, who originally planned to develop for the joint project console. Sad to say, it doesn't matter that it did have some really good titles. In the eyes of history, the N64 was a disproportionately popular blip on the radar that began with the roar that was Mario, Zelda, Banjo, and Smash, and exiting on a whimper with its tail between its legs. And that's all she wrote for the N64. This has been the Hipster Snek, bringing today another bit of Snek tech. Very special thanks to Retro VG Repairs for their handy tutorial in disassembling the unit. I probably really would have hit it with a hammer if I had been left to my own devices. What did you guys think? Did you learn something new today? Leave a comment down below if you did, or if you think I jumped the shark now that I've made fun of something that you really liked when you were a kid. But if you actually did like today's video, tap the like button so I know. For more like this each week, you can hit the subscribe and bell icons too, in order to catch everything as they come. And for yet more from me and my closest bros, you can check out the Tomodachi Bros Podbean and YouTube mirrors. There we talk about anime, manga, movies, and more. And be sure to join me right here every week for more obscure reviews, indie excellence, Snek tech, and more. And I will see you there.